Promises, just empty promises.
In June 1989, Britain's clown prince of comedy, Ken Dodd, was charged with 11 counts of fiddling the taxman. Facing years behind bars and public humiliation, the king of the Diddy Men was about to give the performance of his life.
What a beautiful day for chucking a stone through the windows of the income tax office and shouting, "There, get some blood out of that."
Doddy was the star of the Ken Dodd show. It just happened to be in court with a judge and jury and a brilliant counsel. And that was unique and surreal.
Over 5 captivating weeks, a courtroom drama unfolded. The evidence depicted 2 very different men. The prosecution saw a calculating cheat. The defense, a lovable eccentric who was bad at maths.
We've got a new simplified income tax form this year. New simplified form, only 3 questions. How much money have we got? Where is it? Send it.
It was better than anything you would ever see on TV drama. I mean, you couldn't have made it up. It was a great performance. It was a great show. It was better than anything on the Liverpool Empire. He just seduced the court.
Well, I had thought of going into politics. Oh, yes, I have. As a matter of fact, to be honest, the job I fancy is Chancellor of the Exchequer. At least I'd be reunited with my money.
Ultimately, the comic was cleared, but a highly secretive star had been forced to open his private life to public scrutiny. The world of Kenneth Arthur Dodd was on trial.
Please come back, then we will start anew and try to make those promises come true.
June the 6th, 1989, Liverpool's Crown Court. As the Ken Dodd trial opened, memories of jockey Lester Piggott were fresh in the public's mind. He had been sent to prison 2 years earlier for tax fraud. Dodd wasn't about to submit himself to the same fate and denied all charges. The comedian hired barrister George Carman. It was a smart choice. Carman was a showman and one of the finest advocates of his generation. On day 1, Dodd's QC sprung his first surprise.
The first day of the trial was quite astonishing. Dodd turned up looking very ill, looking very pale. He looked as though he'd been up for about 3 nights. And then we were sitting in the press boxes waiting for all of this. And Carman stood up and quite simply said, "Our man is seriously ill. He cannot stand trial."
The report of the examination carried out in May contains something of a bombshell. It shows that Mr. Dodd suffers from ventricular tachycardia, irregular and fast heartbeats. Because this is a potentially...
Some weeks earlier, Dodd had complained of feeling ill. Seeing a chance to halt the trial even before it began, Carman packed his client off to a doctor who diagnosed a potentially fatal heart condition. But the judge was less than impressed that the news had come at the 11th hour.
I suspect the report on his heart could be repeated about many people in their 60s in this country.
The judge's reaction was rather cynical, and perhaps understandably so. He said something to the effect that this, in terms of the medical condition, could be said of many men in their 60s who were suffering from such conditions, and in his opinion didn't necessarily preclude or should preclude him from standing trial.
The judge said it was inexcusable and inexplicable that the medical examination was carried out so near the trial date, but he did agree to adjourn the case for 2 weeks to allow further tests on Ken Dodd to establish how seriously ill he is.
The court was adjourned for 2 weeks, and of course there's great interest in trying to talk to Dodd and talk to his team. And as he came out the doors of the Liverpool Crown Court, of course he's mobbed, and he did a short sprint and leapt over a flower bed to escape, looking very fit for a man who was about to die on the spot.
No, I mean the one and only Mr. Ken Dodd!
Medical tests showed that Doddy was fit enough to stand trial, and the court duly reconvened 2 weeks later. Barrister Brian Levison, acting for the Revenue, began to outline the prosecution case. He alleged that Dodd had evaded hundreds of thousands in tax and revealed the comic's peculiar obsession with cash.
That for years and years, Mr. Dodd's dealing with the Inland Revenue have been characterised by dishonesty. That when he was given a chance to come clean and tell the truth, he became both devious and deceitful.
It emerged in evidence that Ken Dodd had accumulated cash in shoeboxes over many years from the 1960s through to 1980. £1 and £5 notes primarily wrapped up and put in shoeboxes, under beds, in cupboards, in wardrobes, in different parts of the house. And in evidence he said that he did this because of a dislike of banks, a great fear of what the Labour government in the 1970s might produce. He talked about 98% tax, he talked about the winter of discontent, he talked about his fear of the collapse of banks and the whole economic system.
In defence, Dodd claimed the money was saved from his taxed income and that his passion for cash stemmed from his modest upbringing in Liverpool's suburb, Knotty Ash.
Ken was born at the time of the Wall Street crash. So in his formative years, in the 30s, growing up in the 30s, there was this fear of economic collapse. So cash was very important.
Revealingly, Dodd said that cash was collateral, proof that he was a star.
It made me feel very proud that I generated this kind of cash, and I knew that my father and mother were proud of me. I didn't want a Rolls Royce. You can't go for chips in a Rolls Royce. I stored the cash because I had nothing else.
He comes from, he always has a very happy family. I mean, he was born in Knotty Ash in Liverpool, suburb of Liverpool, which I think was rather more rural then than it is now. I mean, now it's a fairly sort of built-up area. His father was very hard-working, was a coal merchant in Liverpool, very hard-working, I think never took holidays, which is very interesting because Ken has this sort of Puritan drive and this belief you've got to keep working every day of the year.
Money is the subject of tonight's show, folks, and, you know, filthy lucre. Filthy lucre, and nobody knows better than me. Nobody's a bigger filthy lucre than I. Money.
As the court raked over Dodd's accounts, it emerged that he lived a strangely frugal life. The millionaire spent little on food and fun. He hadn't bought a new suit in 2 years, and he took his first holiday at the age of 51. Even then, he bought cut-price tickets.
Dodd appeared miserly. It was quite unfortunate, really. He would shop at C&A, for instance, or Marks & Spencer, and he would possibly spend maybe £500 a year on clothing and £400 a year perhaps on entertaining, and all the other money was hoarded in cash, left in shoeboxes in the attic.
There were always rumours in Liverpool that Ken Dodd was very careful with his money. It's a bit of a joke in the city about Ken's care with money.
Jimmy Talbot was doing a show in Blackpool at the same time, and Tarby invited Doddy to come to the party. Bring a bottle was the implicit message, and this may be apocryphal, but I love it. He turned up with a 4-pack of lager, which he put on top of a fridge, and then spotted a bottle of scotch and drank scotch all the way through the party. And then when he was leaving in the early hours, he saw that the 4-pack of lager was still there and said, "Oh, nobody's had that," and took it home with him.
For Doddy, it had been a long haul to stardom. In court, he described leaving school at 16 and working with his dad, delivering coal. 4 years later, he branched out on his own, selling household goods door to door.
What he'd do is go around selling domestic products, pots and pans and things for the kitchen and things for the home, etc. but he called them KD, K-A-Y-D-W-E products, so they had his own imprint on them. And I think that was where a lot of the act was formed. I mean, he'd go knocking on doors, meeting all these ladies. He'd have to charm them and persuade them and cajole them into buying his products.
And he would say, "Hey, missus, here's your tickling sticks." And that's how his patter developed. But more than that, you've got to remember that Ken is really a salesman and a salesman of jokes. He is a purveyor of humour.
Ladies, can I say how completely discombobulated, how tatty-hilarious to be with you here this evening. First of all, it's me, Mrs. Doddy. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say how tickled I am. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say how tickled I am. Did you see that? They can't touch you very now.
30 years on, it was wads of banknotes rather than pots and pans that Dodd was stuffing in his case. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution argued that the plumptious comic had hidden a huge stash of cash overseas. The trial of Ken Dodd became increasingly bizarre. The prosecution revealed that in 1979, the comic began moving his cash mountain into offshore bank accounts, taking regular cash and carry flights, as the press dubbed them, to Jersey and the Isle of Man.
In 1979, during the year to the 5th of April 1980, he took £79,000 in cash and deposited it in various accounts.
By 1984, Dodd had squirreled away £700,000 in 20 different offshore accounts, a huge amount in today's money.
It took about a day and a half to go through all of the detail of how he took flights from Speke Airport in Liverpool to Jersey and the Isle of Man with suitcases brimming with £5 notes.
Happiness, happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more.
It didn't make sense, because if you don't trust banks, why do you then trust the Jersey and Isle of Man banks?
I'm the luckiest human in the human race. I've got no silver and I've got no gold, but I've got happiness in my soul. Happiness to me is an ocean tide, a sunset fading on a mountainside.
During the following year, he deposited a further £257,000.
One of the planks of the prosecution case was that Dodd hadn't paid tax on overseas interest. Worse still, he had lied to the revenue. He denied the accounts even existed. Dodd claimed he'd been confused by bank adverts and thought the interest was tax-free. He didn't disclose the accounts because the banks were outside British jurisdiction, and in Dodd's mind, it was none of the taxman's business.
One for you, sir. One for you, Sarge. And one for me, too. There's one for you, one for you, one for you, and one for me.
During the trial, there was a story that the prisoners in Walton Jail in Liverpool managed to string a banner up on the outside walls saying, "Coming next week, Ken Dodd."
As the trial unfolded, tax inspectors came and went, and the court heard how the Revenue's investigation had begun. In 1984, Dodd's former accountant, Reg Hunter, had been convicted for false accounting. Although Dodd wasn't directly implicated, several strange letters from the accountant to the comic had aroused the taxman's suspicions.
Dear Ken, you will notice once again the Ken Dodd Enterprises balance sheet omits its greatest asset. It is the Great Drum, better known in stock exchange circles as the Aladdin's Cave of Knotty Ash. Long may that priceless possession remain secluded in the Merseyside mangrove swamps.
Starting out in the early 50s as Professor Chucklebutty, Dodd built a reputation playing clubs and pubs around Merseyside.
Cheer pictures for souvenirs.
The jury heard that by the mid-60s, he had become one of the highest paid performers in Britain.
Memories of a love you never met.
Doddy was now a major TV star and a chart-topping singer.
I just can't believe.
But his first love remained the stage, and in '65 he travelled south to begin a record-breaking 40-week stint at the London Palladium.
He came to the Palladium as a comic with a northern reputation, a very strong one, and he was booked in for a few weeks. They thought probably it'd run, 8 or 10 weeks or something. He played, if I remember rightly, for the whole of that summer and into the autumn, and played twice nightly, 3 times on Saturdays, packed out every performance, and he became a symbol of success. It was as if swinging London had somehow been encapsulated on that stage at the Palladium. It was everything that made London joyous in the 60s. The fun, the celebration, the sexuality, the freedom was all there on the Palladium stage in this extraordinarily energetic comic. The Beatles, Liverpudlians came to visit Ken. Everyone came to visit Ken.
I'm in court this Christmas. We'll all be in court after this.
Liverpool's biggest comedian had allegedly built up his undeclared nest egg through a simple ruse. Dodd had regularly demanded part cheque, part cash when appearing on stage. 2 weeks into the trial, Terry Hesketh, a former manager of the Cirque House Hotel in Lancashire, was called to the witness box. Hesketh had booked Doddy in the early 80s for a series of cabaret evenings.
The first time it was £1,000 for the performance, and part of that was in cheque and part in cash, which when he came down the stairs after the performance, I gave to him and he shot off, and he never stayed behind and had a drink. He was away.
George Carman, cross-examining Hesketh, suggested that the cash was in order to pay Dodd's retinue of musicians and performers.
He asked me, did Ken Dodd have a band? Did he have other people helping him? And truthfully, I had to answer, and the answer was no, because he was just a one person by himself. But he did bring along a lot of tickling sticks.
Wait now and tell me this.
The Revenue claimed that Dodd's cash dodge had continued throughout the 80s, despite a Conservative government and large cuts in income tax. Margaret Thatcher had no greater fan than the self-employed comedian.
I love
The admiration was mutual, and in '82 the Squire of Knotty Ash became OBE.
People often wonder what is in the Chancellor's little briefcase. Yes, well, what we have got to do is try and stretch our resources. Stretch our resources, do something about inflation. And here I have an incentive for all the workers.
According to the prosecution, a year before receiving his gong, Dodd had demanded part payment in cash for a charity event held at Derby's Assembly Rooms. Unluckily for Dodd, it was organised by an off-duty tax inspector, Peter Dolman, who became a key witness at the trial.
Just before the day, I was told he didn't want all this money by cheque. He wanted £1,550 of this £2,700 in cash on the night immediately after the show. The show ended, we were sort of clearing up, and we were summoned, you wanted. The door of the dressing room opened. Ken Dodd was putting his trousers on, and there we were, standing in front of his girlfriend. She put a hand out, flat of a hand, and said, "Money." Then the treasurer produced this bit of paper, and he presented it to Ken Dodd and said, "I think I'm entitled to receipt for my records." And Ken instantly sort of seemed, there was a sense of fear there in his eyes. I could see it.
Dodd's cash demands were central to the Inland Revenue case, but Carman's claim that the readies were used to pay his diddy men had sowed the first seeds of doubt. As the comic's fate hung in the balance, the trial took an unexpected twist. One morning, George Carman dramatically called for the 12 jurors to be cleared from the court.
A juryman over the weekend had gone out for drinking in Liverpool city centre, and on his way home was talking to the taxi driver and said, "You'll never guess what, I'm on the jury of the Ken Dodd trial." And he's as guilty as fuck. That's what he said. So the taxi driver then drove to Ken Dodd's home and put a letter through his letterbox to say, "I think you should know what's happened." And the man was discharged with a bollocking from the judge.
In spite of Dodd's enormous popularity in the city, it had been the prosecution's choice to hold the trial on Dodd's home turf. Moreover, Liverpool Crown Court had the highest rate of acquittal in the country.
A Liverpool jury is actually a legal term. Among barristers, they refer to, I won't say a bloody-minded jury, but of a jury of a certain attitude, which is very questioning, as a Liverpool jury.
What's more, there's little love lost between Liverpool and the taxman, and George Carman exploited this to the full.
Ultimately, Carman put the Inland Revenue on trial for allegedly bullying Ken Dodd. And halfway through the trial, the emphasis switched onto their tactics, their questioning. They were accused of being the Gestapo. It was quite extraordinary. And all of a sudden, the sympathy came back to Dodd.
After almost 3 weeks, Brian Leveson for the prosecution closed.
If Brian Leveson QC made one mistake, in my father's view, it was that he failed to keep it simple. It was a long prosecution case, it was extremely thorough, and it was very, very detailed. But unfortunately, it may in the process have lost much of the jury's concentration at the same time.
In contrast, the defence was to be short, sharp, and entertaining. The Tattyfillaria's Ken Dodd and his sidekick George Carman were poised to bring their double act centre stage. "13 days into the trial of Ken Dodd, the defence opened. George Carman claimed that his client might have been mistaken, but never dishonest. The QC gambled that the eccentric story of the king of the Diddy men would sway the jury.
Mr. Carman said, "To Ken Dodd, accountancy is a mysterious world which passes all understanding. It's as fanciful to him as the world of the Diddy men or the jam-butty mines of Knotty Ash, which he created."
Now it was Ken Dodd's turn to take the witness stand, and the accused was ready to play court jester.
At one stage, George Carman became Ken Dodd's stooge. I mean, that's what it was. He was the feed. It was like a double act.
Dodd began telling jokes, and he made everybody laugh. And he made everyone laugh, particularly when he was talking about his upbringing and his grandmother.
"My grandmother was the first lady magistrate in Liverpool, and also chairman of the Old Swan Labour Party.
And she had 16 children?
She knew all about Labour, yes."
And he was really rapped down by the judge. The judge told him that he was not on stage, that it was a serious court of law.
People in the north, they've got big hearts. People in the north, they'll always make you welcome. They'll always invite you back to their homes for a fight. And you say, come in, lad, and warm this here. Now, sit thee down. Not there, that's it.
The defence knew that Dodd's enormous appeal in Liverpool was because, while Merseyside's other great 60s stars, the Beatles, Cilla, Tarby, had moved south, he had stayed. Doddy said his humour, born of the music hall, needed the nourishment of his northern roots.
The whole reference point in his act is to a working class world that he grew up in, that he knew intimately, and that he has somehow preserved for us through theatre. Ken has sort of pickled and marinated and preserved this world and seen its comic aspects. But at the same time, he combines that working class comedy with this adventure into the world of the imagination and the wild and the strange.
I was in the back kitchen in our house, and I was just trying half a ping-pong ball on the budgie head and saying, hello, Cardinal. And then...
Images is what Ken Dodd is very good at, supplying weird, strange imageries. So he's rather like a mixture of a McGill seaside postcard and a Magritte painting, and it's McGill and Magritte combined that make Ken Dodd so extraordinary.
Remarkably, Dodd still lived in the same Notty-Ash house in which he'd been born and raised. On day 2 of the defence, a video, produced and directed by George Carman, of the Oddball Comics home was shown to illustrate Dodd's eccentricities.
And it was truly astonishing. It was an average house, the rooms were of average size, and yet they were packed, top to bottom, with props. There was a pantomime horse, there was costumes, everything that he'd appeared in, and through each room was like a narrow pathway where you would go from one door to the next and make your way through all this paraphernalia.
And of course, people in the court were fascinated by this because nobody's ever been in Ken's house, nobody's ever filmed in Ken's house at all, to my knowledge. And Ken was doing the voiceover, if you like, from the witness box. And then you go up the stairs, you see this handheld video, and you sweep into this bedroom. And there's a double bed with a green coverlet on it, and Ken tells the court, "Oh, that's my side of the bed." And the judge put his hand up and said to Mr. Carman, please tell your client to restrain himself.
The thinking behind the video was simple, was to show to the jury the home of the man as an illustration of the chaos of the lifestyle which he enjoyed at home.
At heart, Carman's strategy was clear. Rather than rebut the prosecution's allegations in detail, he would portray Dodd as a lovable shambles with a bizarre lifestyle and a poor grasp of accountancy.
He painted the character of someone who was eccentric, who left all his affairs to somebody else, and all of that responsibility of taking the flights to Jersey, taking the flights to the Isle of Man, was forgotten. It went. It was just, here's Dodd, here's the funny man from Notty-Ash. What a life of chaos. He's innocent.
Michael Billington was called as a character witness to help bolster the defence case.
And it was a very interesting occasion. I flew up to Liverpool that morning, I remember, went to the courtroom, and about half an hour before the curtain went up, as it were, I met George Carman. I was in a private room, and he asked me lots of questions, and he seized on one particular thing I said, and that became the motif of our public cross-examination, if you like. I said I thought Ken was a genius on stage, but often chaotic in his life. And Carman, with his usual incisiveness, seized on it and said, yes, we'll talk about that.
He wanted to show the simple message that members of the jury, this financial information you've heard is very complicated. Ken Dodd found it very complicated. He didn't understand much of it. And let me tell you why. And this is the reason why. This is the chaotic world of Ken Dodd. Let me introduce you to it.
Forward, men! Charge! Everybody march around the theatre! That's it!
Dodd may have been disorganized off stage, but in front of his audience, he had always been highly disciplined. The jury was now invited to consider this unique obsession.
Since I've been stripped naked in this court, I may as well tell you the lot. For 40 years, I've read every possible book on humor and the psychology of humor. I've formulated formulas for the creation of jokes and comedy, and I believe I've cracked it.
He's a great student. He'll quote you his Freud and Bergman on the subject of humour, and his famous remark about the problem with Freud is he never played Glasgow Empire on a Friday night. But he does study it very carefully. All his jokes and lines are codified according to where he told them, they're dated, what town it was, and he will refer back to that if he's going to Bradford, say, or whatever, what went well in Bradford.
Last Thursday afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I was in Yugoslavia. The conductor of the bus said, I'm sorry about this, but it's a new driver.
And he used to have a ledger, he still does, I think, where he would actually analyse how a gag went on a certain night, whether it got a big belly laugh or, medium laugh or no laugh at all. He always argues that in the South, people like a slightly gentler, more relaxed form of humour. In the North, they like a sort of harder and tougher type of gag.
We're very fond of moggies, on Merseyside. In Kirby, if you see a cat with a tail, it's a tourist.
The charm offensive in Court 5 continued. Dodd's devout Anglican beliefs were mentioned. So too was his support for a local hospital and several cancer charities. His generosity hinged on heartbreak in his personal life. In 1977, Anita Boutin, Dodd's fiancée of some 25 years, died of a brain tumour.
She was a nurse, and it was a lovely romance. She was very much, when he was a young comedian, she was by his side all the time. And so the relationship was very, very close. And I believe that they were all set to be married. But it just didn't happen. And I don't know the reason for it, whether it was a religious reason. I don't know whether it was personal, whether it was family.
What do you mean by religious?
I think she was a different religion to Ken. I think she was a Roman Catholic. That's only what people say in Liverpool. I mean, I don't know. But in fact, the wedding didn't take place, and she died.
Tears for souvenirs are all you left.
Dodd bought and then abandoned a Shropshire home where he planned to stay with Anita.
It was quite a beautiful house. It was big. I remember a beautiful maple tree being in the front garden with an abandoned fridge or a freezer. And it almost stood, in a way, for an element of Dodd's life, this unfulfillment, this idea that this is where he would bring his first bride and they would live together happily.
After all those happy hours we spent.
Ladies, I want you to take this coat, if you will, round to the back of the shed and go to my dressing room. If I'm not there by 10 o'clock, start without me. All swag, ladies.
On stage, Dodd's relationship with women was happier and less complicated. For the buck-toothed comic, sex is at the heart of every show.
Did you see that? They can't touch you very, not if you've been sponsored.
His whole act is based around phallic jokes. I mean, the tickling stick is a phallic symbol. As he says, the sort of, the hair which he gathers up into a sort of single cone is a phallic symbol. So sex hovers around the act for the whole evening, but I don't think the word sex itself is ever mentioned. If you look at the Ken Dodd audience, it's probably composed largely of middle-aged women, middle-aged to elderly women. Why? Why are they the ones who laugh most probably at Ken Dodd jokes? I think it's because they're part of a generation where sex was taboo.
You look very well, you look as though you've got a... What I mean is, you look as though you've got a lot.
And Dodd is roguish, aiming at the women all the time. And of course, it's one of the great tenets that if you get the women in the audience, the men cheerfully join in, and a lot of great comedians have actually aimed at the women in the audience.
To win his freedom, Carman convinced Dodd that he would have to lay his most private life bare. And Dodd spoke of his desperation to have a family. After the death of his fiancée, he had met a new love, former Bluebell dancer Annie Jones. 4 weeks into the trial, Jones arrived in court to hear Dodd tearfully detail their unsuccessful fertility treatment.
I think the introduction of the evidence relating to fertility treatment and attempts to conceive were regarded as very important by my father, first of all because it told a human story to which people could relate. It might have been seen by some as being very dramatic, but it was in fact the truth. It's what had happened.
Dodd claimed he had failed to disclose his overseas bank accounts at a key interview with the revenue because he was literally knackered. The night before this crucial tax meeting, after a lengthy stint on stage, he'd driven for 7 hours home to Knotty Ash so as to have sex after his partner's IVF injection.
There was all sorts of bizarre, intimate details about having to have sex at certain times of the day and night. It wasn't anything to do with pound shillings and pence, if you like, but it did have a bearing on his emotional state when he was dealing, as he said, this agonizing 5 years or whatever it was, when he was dealing with the revenue.
As the defense case drew to a close, British comedy was lining up behind Doddy. The Tattifilarious courtroom double act had a final trick to tickle the jury with. A blazing June in 1989, and Liverpool Crown Court increasingly resembled the Ken Dodd Laughter and Tears show. As the trial approached its climax, veteran showbiz stars Eric Seitz and Roy Hudd were called as character witnesses.
Doddy's tax trial was a show produced by George Carman, the QC, who could have got Hitler off, an amazing man who manipulated it completely. George Carman knew that the prosecution had enough ammunition to shoot them down. They had the facts and the figures. So Carman realized he'd have to play it on a different level and played it as a show, and produced Eric Sykes and Roy Hudd out of a hat.
I should think he's probably the most admired and respected and original comedian we've produced in this country in the last 40 years.
There's been a lot of talk about his attitude to money, obviously. You said in court he was very generous with his time.
Yeah.
Is he generous with his money?
Certainly he's generous with his time. About he's generous with his money, I've never asked him for money, so I couldn't do it.
I said that I think happiness is the greatest medicine one can have, in which case this nation owes Ken Dodd a great deal for giving them good health they've had. Anyway, I've got to catch a plane now. Excuse me.
Thank you.
And it was like a chat show. Carman was producing it. He was in control by that time. Incidentally, they only said he was a great comic. He was a great comedian. That's all. And then the tack switched to how good professionally he was. It had nothing to do with tax evasion. It was all about him being a good comedian.
In the trial of Regina versus Kenneth Arthur Dodd, it was time for the summing up. While the prosecution repeated the allegation that Dodd was a serial tax cheat, Carman would produce a quote that has since passed into courtroom legend.
He stood leaning backwards, critically looking at the jury, and he kept their attention, he kept them listening. And he produced the line which has become best known from the case.
One thing we have learned from this trial is that comedians are not chartered accountants, but sometimes chartered accountants are comedians.
The prosecution case had been thorough, but Dodd's defense had been a dramatic masterpiece. It had played well to both the jury and Judge Waterhouse.
During the course of the case, my father thought the judge swung his way and that he had started off in hostile manner. So my father was heartened to some degree by hearing the judge summing up the case in a way which was not as hostile as it might have been.
This morning, as he completed his summing up, the judge had told the jury that the central issue to the case was the prosecution's allegations that Dodd had been deliberately dishonest. He said that if the jury had...
After 5 weeks of humour and pathos, the jury was sent to deliberate. Unable at first to reach a unanimous verdict on all counts, they spent the night in a hotel. At 1:30 the following day, a tense court reconvened.
Weary-looking Ken Dodd, who made his way towards the courthouse, which has been his stage for the last 23 days. He's now reached the final act. It was the jury's turn to steal the limelight.
There were actually people almost literally fighting to get in. And I remember a reporter arrived late and they closed the doors, and all we heard was this bong on the door. It was like a coconut going against the door, and it was this reporter's head apparently, because things got a little bit violent.
My bet was that he was going to be found guilty. I thought there was no doubt here, and told my news desk to be prepared.
I thought it could go either way. I didn't know. I mean, it's very difficult. Probably the best yardstick is, if when the jury come back, if they look at the defendant, they've usually acquitted him. Now, in this case, they did look at Ken when he came in.
The foreman stood up, and for that moment, you can literally hear the pin drop. It is a remarkable occasion. And then, of course, the not guilty, and there is just a huge cheer.
And as each not guilty verdict came, his face, you know Ken Dodd's face, he was gesticulating, his emotions were all on the surface, hair flying.
I'm the luckiest human in the human race. I've got no silver and I've got no gold, but I've got happiness in my soul. Happiness to me is an ocean tide.
Dodd's girlfriend Annie Jones collapsed in tears. Liverpool city centre ground to a halt, and Kenneth Arthur Dodd emerged to meet his audience.
Happiness, happiness, the greatest gift.
I'd just like to say, thank God it's all over.
After toasting his acquittal, he had to fight his way through the crowds to a waiting car that whisked him away.
For the comedian, acquittal marked the end of 5 years of investigation and personal turmoil. For his Diddyman barrister, George Carman, it was an important victory.
My father loved to win. He absolutely loved to win. And the victory in Ken Dodd remained with him. In fact, the Ken Dodd case put him at a higher level. It was very much a defining moment.
The revenue had lost the battle, but not the war. The Dodd trial served as a powerful public health warning on the perils of tax evasion. And in the aftermath, tax receipts poured in from the showbiz world.
There was a tradition, not by me, of course, that the comedians would be paid partly with a cheque and the rest in cash, which was an obvious device to get round. The officially stated one was the cheque. And there is now a legend in the business, we call it post-Dodd. People don't do it.
Ken Dodd was a free man, but at a cost. He handed the revenue more than £800,000 in unpaid tax and penalties. And with his enormous legal and accountancy bills, he was now virtually bankrupt. Worse still, the famously private star's personal life was public property.
You've had the slurs, the allegations that have been made on you during this trial, how much has it hurt?
Very much so. Very much so, because I know in my heart of hearts that I'm an honest man. And I know probably I'm an untidy person, but, you know, I shall do my best to be tidier from now on.
I thought that was the irony of everything that went on. He would never, ever have wanted all of that intimate detail about his sexual life, about his living arrangements, about how he spent his money or how he hoarded his money, to reveal the contents of his home. He would never have wanted that. I think, on balance, he lost out.
What happens now?
I've only ever wanted to be a comedian. I've only ever wanted to entertain the public. So I shall go on trying to do that.
Now in his mid-70s, Ken Dodd still lives in the same knotty ash home. He still follows the same grueling schedule of nationwide sellout shows, and he has turned the events that nearly ruined him into a series of jokes about dodgy accountants and bullying tax inspectors.
You still write to me. They said they'd keep in touch. I got a Christmas card from him. He said, "'Tis more blessed to give than to receive."
The great thing about Ken Dodd is that he's survived. I mean, 1954, as I say, he makes his professional debut. Here we are in 2002. He's still at it. He's still going strong. Some of the gags are much the same. He's still touring Britain, performing. And I suppose, to make a rather strange comparison, he's the Queen Mum of British comedy. We admire him for his survival capacity and because he reminds us of where we've come from.
200 years we've been paying this. Like 200 years ago, this balmy MP, he's sitting along there in Westminster one afternoon, he's got... He thinks I know, he said. I know. I'll invent income tax. I'll invent income tax. And so he did, 200 years ago. In those days, it was tuppence in the pound. I thought it still was. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for being a tatty hilarious and a bumptious audience.